When did the pollution start exactly? What moment in time? When did the bad thing happen? This is going to determine which year of insurance response, which ladder on that horizontal timeline needs to get involved. Hi, I'm Meredith Brasher, and this is the Insurance versus History podcast. Or, as I like to say, the podcast that does for insurance what Freakonomics did for economics. If you're someone who's into history, or you work in insurance, or you just want to learn why insurance matters, both the good and the bad, this podcast is for you. In today's episode, I'm talking about a company called Montrose Chemical, the history of DDT, and an insurance court case that lasted more than 40 years. Here's a question for you. When does something bad happen? No, seriously. The question here is when? When exactly, at what moment in time, can we say a bad thing happened? Before I do that, welcome back to Season 5. I've made some changes this year, and this season I am delivering episodes twice a month, one longer episode and one shorter episode. I'll be playing with format, length, and everything else based on the feedback I've gotten from all of you and my own ideas. If you like or don't like the changes, I would love to hear it, but be nice, please. And of course, make sure to rate and review me on your podcast player of choice. Before I get started, I wanted to introduce some insurance terminology important for this episode. While the Montrose Chemical case is about pollution, this isn't really an episode about pollution. If you're totally new to insurance, well, welcome to a story about general liability. General liability is insurance that provides what we in the industry call third-party coverage. If the first party is the company buying the insurance, in this case Montrose Chemical, and the second party is the insurance company, the third party is someone who is unrelated to those two parties. You slip and fall on a grape on a grocery store floor. You're injured by throwing lawn darts. You are the third party in that situation. Got it? And one of the basic tenets of GL insurance is that anything covered by the insurance policy is unexpected and unintended. The company buying the insurance, in this case Montrose Chemical, did not know something would happen or that it was happening when they bought the insurance. Liability insurance doesn't like covering losses that we already know about or are in progress when the policy is written. You know, if the house is already on fire, so to speak. As a result, it's common that everyone goes to court to argue about who knew what and when, and that was definitely the case with Montrose Chemical. Another useful concept is something called a tower of insurance. Imagine a ladder with lots of rungs. The first rung of the ladder is the general liability policy, which pays for the first $1 million or so of any covered loss. If you need more coverage than $1 million, and you usually do if you're a company of decent size, you buy something called an excess policy. That excess policy sits on the rung above the GL, and it only pays for a loss if the rung lowest to the ground, the GL, runs out of money. It's, well, excess. Depending on your tolerance for risk and the types of things your company does, you may buy rung after rung of excess policies and end up with a very tall ladder of rungs, a tall ladder of insurance limits. Each rung waits for the rungs below to run out of money before they start paying. A large company like Montrose, in business for decades, has separate insurance towers, these ladders, for each year they buy insurance. You think of a horizontal timeline, and each year has its own separate ladder. It's very common that the ladders for different years are different sizes. Some years they're taller because Montrose bought more insurance, and some years maybe the ladders are shorter. The size of the ladder might not be the only difference. Maybe one year covers your loss, but another year excludes that kind of loss. In this case, that's going to be a problem. If I was a betting woman and setting odds on the fight between insurance and history today, I'm guessing history might win. We'll see. Let's dig in. The story of Montrose starts during World War II with the development of DDT. U.S. success in World War II wasn't just military might and strategy. It also required important but mundane things like successful disease management and effective food and supply storage. Soldiers were living in tough, dirty conditions. Enormous amounts of supplies were required to keep the military functioning. You can't fight a war if your soldiers are too sick or malnourished to do anything. And bugs, well, not just bugs, but the diseases that accompanied them, were a real problem. Mostly we're talking about lice, which causes typhus. But other diseases like malaria and the critters that damage food and supplies were also a big concern. Pesticides were the most effective way to reduce disease and reduce military supply damage. But before World War II, there were few effective pesticides, and they were often dangerous, expensive, and required frequent reapplication. The military needed better solutions. In 1941, Victor Frolicker, a U.S. chemist, began investigating a new European pesticide. This product had an odd chemical makeup, mostly chlorine and benzene. In theory, it shouldn't have been a pesticide, but it seemed to work. Frolicker pitched it to the U.S. Surgeon General, Thomas Perrin. Perrin was sold, and the U.S. military began looking for manufacturing facilities. As an aside, Paul Hermann Mueller, a Swiss scientist, received the Nobel for the development of DDT in 1948, and I have to ask, does the Nobel Society ever take back awards? Well, to be clear, no one was really sure how this chemical worked or why it worked, and the USDA wasn't even sure it was safe, but it worked. And even better, one application worked for a month or more. The British called it DDT. The U.S. Federal War Production Board asked chemical companies in the U.S. to start making DDT. DuPont, Merck, Monsanto, Pennsylvania Salt, and Sherwin-Williams, as well as smaller companies like Montrose Chemical Company. At the height of wartime DDT production, they pumped out 3 million pounds every month. And the Army sprayed everything with DDT: clothing, food, tents, you name it. Planes sprayed DDT over Europe and the Pacific arena. Disease decreased, so DDT seemed to be a game changer. After the war was over, the companies who made DDT for the U.S. had to decide whether or not to continue to manufacture it. On the plus side, it was cheap, easy to make, and there was no patent. On the minus side, it was cheap to buy, and there was no patent. Most chemical companies stopped making DDT and focused on pesticides they could patent. Those pesticides made more money. The late 1940s and 50s were a time of tremendous growth for the pesticide industry. You could call it the pesticide decade. In a span of about 15 years, U.S. markets developed 900 different pesticides, and approximately 45,000 pesticide-related products entered the consumer market. And the very cheap, easy-to-make DDT was seen as a solution to all kinds of things, or at least it was marketed that way. For example, DDT was presented as a solution to malaria. That was still an issue in the southern U.S. in the late 1940s. DDT was also considered a possible solution for polio. If you aren't familiar with polio, well, it's hard to understate just how terrifying an outbreak of polio was for people living at that time. Polio, we now know, is not spread by insects, it's viral. When DDT began being used to combat polio, scientists didn't know what caused polio. Some thought it might be transmitted by houseflies. If that was true, which it wasn't, well, using DDT to combat polio made sense, but by the 1950s, scientists were pretty sure polio was viral. In a real victory for marketing over facts, however, places in the U.S. continued to spray DDT to prevent polio, even knowing that it really did nothing. And this went on as late as the 1970s. There was a perception among the public that DDT was doing something, and it, quote, kept America open for business even as polio spread, unquote. Sound familiar? As a result of the interest in using DDT to combat disease, not to mention that the chemical wasn't patented, Many smaller chemical companies continued making DDT. One of these companies was Montrose Chemical. And when I say small, I mean very small. Even when Montrose was manufacturing for World War II, they had 10 employees. One thing people buying DDT didn't realize, but was quickly becoming a problem for manufacturers, was that DDT created a lot of waste product. Because the chemical makeup of DDT was so innocuous, there was little concern about disposal. Companies like Montrose let waste products drain into the sewer system, or they stored them in retention ponds, where they soaked into the soil. What they didn't realize, or didn't care, is that these waste products carried a little bit of DDT with them. Montrose expanded after the war by relocating to a larger plant in Torrance, California, 15 miles south of Los Angeles. By 1956, Montrose Chemical made 40% of all DDT in the U.S. Increased production also meant increased waste products, to the point that the waste product dumped into the public sewer regularly overflowed the system. Some waste was so thick it couldn't be disposed that way. Instead, Montrose stored about 10,000 gallons of waste a day in barrels, eventually working with a company called California Salvage to dump those barrels into the ocean or local landfills. This was all legal and above board. Scientists continued to investigate DDT to determine if it was safe inside and outside the U.S. government. In the 1960s, a new group of people started to ask questions about pesticide use in general and the environmental and human effects of that use. Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring was published in 1962, and that raised significant public awareness of pesticide use and the potentially harmful effects of that use. Suddenly, lots of non-scientist people were interested in what pesticides were doing. Two main groups were actively involved in asking questions about pesticide use in the 60s. First, wildlife researchers, a group of whom eventually formed the Environmental Defense Fund. And second, the United Farm Workers Union in California. If you've heard the name Cesar Chavez before, he was one of the most visible members of the United Farm Workers Union in California, by the way. While the California branch of the United Farm Workers was focused on overall pesticide use and how it could harm farm workers and consumers, that time, California grew 40% of the fruits and vegetables sold in the U.S. The Environmental Defense Fund was focused on the decline of bird populations in and around areas either sprayed by DDT or where DDT was manufactured. And there had been a significant reduction in bird populations, like a lot. It was an opportune time for this discussion because President Nixon established the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970. Previously, chemicals like DDT were investigated by multiple different government agencies. One of the main goals of the EPA was to bring these efforts under one roof, as agencies didn't always talk to each other and they often worked at cross purposes. Some of the agencies used entirely different scientific methods. A chemical that one would find to be completely safe would be found inherently dangerous by another. That was a problem, and the EPA was hoping to solve it. One of the first things the EPA was asked to rule on was DDT. In 1972, after several years of contentious hearings and lawsuits, the EPA banned DDT use in the U.S. with an exception for public disease control. In 1972, 99% of all DDT use was in agricultural production or disease management for ornamental and shade trees, so this change was enormous. The use of DDT as a household pesticide had long been supplanted by patented pesticides from other companies. Even though DDT was effectively banned in the U.S., manufacturers like Montrose Chemical could still sell freely to overseas buyers. Problem solved, right? The EPA was about to find out that the waste from DDT production during the past 30 years was an even bigger issue than they ever thought. The earliest indication that waste product from DDT production plants was a problem involved a plant in Alabama built on U.S. Army property. Olin Chemical, that's O-L-I-N, They were a company that produced DDT for the U.S. during World War II and then for the commercial market until about 1970. After the plant closed over a leasing dispute, the Army discovered that the waste products from Olin's manufacturing processes were now their problem. Some of the drainage ditches around the plant contained as much as 74% DDT. The Army also discovered that DDT did not disappear, despite their best efforts. In fact, DDT migrated into local waterways in concerning amounts. DDT, it turned out, had a half-life of more than 15 years. Nobody knew that. It turns out that DDT is a slow-acting pesticide when it comes to creatures larger than, say, a housefly. DDT stays in the body of a living thing for a long time, and apex predators seem to get it the worst. As they eat things contaminated with DDT, the DDT builds up in their bodies, eventually affecting their reproductive and endocrine systems. Birds and wildlife died as early as the 1950s. Scientists were noticing issues in areas where DDT had been disposed of, but even worse, the animals that survived struggled to reproduce successfully. For birds like bald eagles, it was catastrophic. It would take decades for DDT to really appear in humans at an amount to be damaging, but even then, the extent of the damage wasn't clear. Most people in the U.S., almost all of us, have DDT in our bodies in some amount. Sorry. The people living around the Olin chemical plant in Alabama, that was a community that was mostly Black and heavily polluted by DDT. Those people are still dealing with what DDT is doing to their families. Olin and their insurance policies did provide some funds to compensate those people affected by DDT, but again, DDT is such a slow-acting chemical in humans, it is still unclear what all the long-term effects are. In 1980, Congress passed CERCLA, or as most people know it, Superfund. This law required the EPA to create a list of contaminated sites in the U.S. and to hold the private parties financially responsible. The area around Montrose Chemical in Torrance, California was particularly concerning. The EDF had investigated wildlife die-off in the areas around the coast of Southern California, and scientists identified high levels of DDT in many birds and marine wildlife. In 1982, the EPA sent Montrose a letter explaining they might be financially responsible for the cleanup of 2 Superfund sites. This is when things start to get a little complicated and very legal. The first letter the EPA sent to Montrose Chemical Company in August 1982 identified Montrose as a, quote, potentially responsible party, unquote. And this wording is very important. Regarding a hazardous waste disposal site owned by a company named J.B. Stringfellow. That site was known as the Stringfellow Acid Pits, which should have been an indication that maybe there was something wrong with that site. That name is, who gave it that name? But this acid pits was the location of significant disposal of Montrose DDT waste products between 1966 and 1972, and the site had recently been designated by the EPA as a Superfund site. Waste, not just DDT waste from Montrose, but PCBs and other pollutants from other companies too, contaminated both the site itself and the soil and local waterways. In 1983, the federal government officially sued Montrose in a lawsuit under CERCLA called United States v. J.B. Stringfellow. So this is a year after that letter went out. The lawsuit named Montrose Chemical and several other companies as defendants. Eventually, Montrose would be named in 4 other governmental lawsuits, and the site of Montrose's plant in Torrance would eventually be designated a Superfund site. However, this does not take into consideration the lawsuits I actually want to talk about today, which are lawsuits involving Montrose suing all of its insurance carriers. To be honest, if you want to talk about all the lawsuits that Montrose was involved in, you probably have to make a big wall map with policies and string and pushpins, and I would look like a crazy person explaining conspiracy theories. You might still feel that way anyway as I start to lay it out for you in the next section. Montrose, of course, didn't have the money to just spend hundreds of millions of dollars on pollution cleanup on their own. That's why they buy insurance, right? Insurance was bound to get involved. Even without the issues involved in this case, which were, well, legion, there was just no way the insurance companies were going to pony up this kind of money without going to court first. Sadly, this is one problem insurance has never been able to solve. It is true the industry ends up going to court a lot to hash things out. Or is it intentional? I have opinions about this, that's true, and I do think that some of this could be reduced with some common sense changes. Part of the problem here was that while there had been other pollution losses involving other companies in the past, Montrose Chemical's involvement in one of the first Superfund sites meant that there were a lot of new issues that had not been previously contemplated by insurance that really needed to be resolved. First, no one was agreed on what the letter from the EPA to Montrose Chemical, that letter that identified Montrose as a, quote, potentially responsible party, unquote, what that meant. Was it telling Montrose they were going to have financial responsibility? Was it a notice of loss, which would mean that the insurance companies would need to be involved immediately? I mean, even the EPA was hedging their bets by using such vague wording. And this letter mattered a whole lot to the insurance companies who were currently insuring Montrose when the letter was received. This is where we get into the issue of when a loss is, as we say, known. Who knew what, when? When did the pollution start exactly? What moment in time? When did the bad thing happen? This is going to determine which year of insurance response, which ladder on that horizontal timeline needs to get involved. Now, the obvious answer from someone who is not in insurance might be that the pollution started when Montrose started putting DDT-related waste into the sewer and dumping it into retention ponds. That the first moment they did any of that, pollution happened. Okay. You might also argue that the dumping of these DDT wastes wasn't an accident. Montrose decided to dispose of their waste in this way, and since it wasn't an accident, it was intentional on the part of the company that, as a result, insurance shouldn't cover it anyway. Liability insurance covers things that are unexpected or unintended, not the stuff they did on purpose. So, no coverage for you, Montrose. Well, but did Montrose know that the waste product was pollution? These days, this seems like such a crazy question to ask. But at the time they did the dumping, Montrose had all the necessary permits and everything was legal. There might have been someone at Montrose who worried about dumping all this waste into the surrounding land and local waterways, but as far as we know, that person, if they existed, never said anything publicly. At some point, when Montrose was disposing of DDT waste products, some level of pollution was hit, at which point the DDT did visible damage to wildlife. Was that the moment when Montrose knew about the possible pollution? You can get really granular here. Was it the first bird that died? Or was it when a particular bird population went on the endangered species list? I mean, at what exact point can we say, for insurance purposes, the pollution happened? When does the DDT waste product become enough pollution to matter? This is an exceptionally complicated question because it would then decide which insurance policies needed to respond. For example, if it was decided that the pollution happened as soon as the first species went on the endangered species list, well, we know that DDT takes a long time to build up in a species to the point of doing damage, so that might mean that policy would be in the late 1970s. That would mean any policy before that date did not have to pay for the loss. For the insurance policies that were written after the EPA letter came and before the lawsuit happened, those insurance policies wanted to make sure they weren't going to have to pay out either. Just FYI, when Montrose got that EPA letter, no one at Montrose told any of their insurance companies about it at all. And the courts didn't make this any clearer because there is this funny court-created thing in liability called the trigger. The trigger, this is a word that does not appear in any general liability insurance policy or excess policy. The concept of trigger is a monster topic, and I will not burden you with it, but the gist of it here is the courts decided that there was no one moment in time when the pollution happened. It happened over a long period of time, true, and as a result, any insurance policy written in any year where this pollution was happening was responsible for paying for the loss. There was no one moment in time when the bad thing happened. Basically, the house had always been on fire. If you think insurance is a scam and that they always win, this is a great example of when insurance loses catastrophically for the public good. Now, instead of one ladder in 1 year being responsible to pay the loss from the pollution, we have 20 plus years of policies being told they are all equally responsible. And as you might expect, this does result in the end in a lot more money being paid on the loss, because 20 years of insurance policies is a lot of insurance money to pay out. But it also means that every single insurance company involved is going to go to court to argue about it. What the court said about all this is exceptionally entertaining, but I'm particularly taken by the court statement that this is the most efficient way to allocate among insurers for toxic waste cases because it encourages all insurers to monitor risks and charge appropriate premium. To which I reply, huh? Because how was any insurance company who wrote Montrose in prior years supposed to know about pollution at the time they wrote the policy? I'm sure there were some exploding heads at the insurance companies when they read that. Talk about putting the responsibility for avoiding loss on the insurance company. And trust me, you don't want that. When was the exact moment that the loss happened? Again, the court said all of them. When did Montrose know about the loss? In which case, the insurance companies would not have to pay out if Montrose had kept that loss information from those insurance companies. Well, the courts weren't entirely sure about that either, but eventually, they did decide the EPA letter wasn't a lawsuit or a demand for money. It was just a notification. That meant that the current insurance policy was also on the hook for something that had happened many years ago and was only now so important for the EPA to get involved. The coda to this is that they're still arguing about this in court. And a lot of that has to do with how different years had different insurance letters with different policy wording. Makes sense, right? This is a very long period of time, and insurance evolves. General liability insurance in the U.S. in particular was doing a lot of evolving during this time due to a major change in how the judiciary talked about and interpreted contracts involving third parties. The TLDR is basically, we went from a system where buyer and seller were equal parties with equal knowledge to a situation in which one party, the seller, was recognized as having far more knowledge than the buyer. The practical effect of this is if you compare the wording on a liability insurance policy from 2025 and a policy from 1966, it's very different. You could compare a policy from 1966 to 1975 and see that it is also very different. Coverage for pollution in particular went from something that wasn't even really discussed in a 1960s era policy to something that was completely excluded from the policy by the mid-'80s. Montrose had bought some separate pollution insurance when insurance policies began excluding pollution entirely, but pollution insurance as a standalone coverage was a new thing in the 80s, and you could really only buy a very short ladder, so to speak. As a result, the many insurance policies for Montrose over those 20 plus years had vastly different wording about what was covered by the policy and how it was covered. And this issue is also not resolved. In fact, the last thing that the court system said was that someone, and they weren't quite clear who, someone in the lower trial court system would have to go back, compare all the wording in all the different policies in all the different years and figure out who needed to pay what and in what order. This was something like 40 different insurance companies and over 100 policies. Needless to say, and I am sorry to say, everyone would rather fight it out about this some more than actually figure it out. And I don't blame them. This, again, is like the wall of papers with string and push pins trying to figure it out. It would take forever, and it would cost a fortune, paid for by whom? And even then, the insurance companies and the lawyers would disagree. Having said that, I do need to clarify that some insurance companies have paid out on these policies and they aren't fighting it. I've said this before in other episodes, but sometimes insurance chooses to do this rather than spend all the money fighting about it, especially if the policy has a relatively low limit like $1 million. They could easily spend 20 times that million in legal costs, but if they pay out that limit of insurance, they're done, and they can't be asked for more money. They could be sued by their excess carriers arguing about whether or not they should have paid that money out, but that's another topic entirely. So at this point, where legal fees have to be in the tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars over a span of 40 years, why doesn't everyone just do that? Well, saying yes means they're agreeing to the way that the court did things, and that sets precedent. And insurance, not surprisingly, doesn't want that. It's not really good precedent, and I get it. In the end, someone is going to have to pay for this. Now, we, the taxpayers, have ponied up money through taxes and used by the EPA to mitigate the damage, though I don't have a specific number of what's been spent. Between Montrose and the other companies and the insurance, those people have paid out about $100 million already. Notwithstanding the legal messiness that seems to continue even today, without insurance, there would have been a lot less money paid. This is an imperfect story about how insurance happens. It's messy. The issue of Montrose and their insurance coverage is, as of today, again, not resolved, almost 40 years later, as far as I know. Montrose itself went bankrupt, and what was left of the company was sold multiple times. Today, what remains is owned by Bayer, which is an interesting factoid because now you have a company that worked for the Nazis in World War II, and you can look that up, owning a company that worked for the U.S. in World War II. In the meantime, the insurance industry responded by creating wording that defined when a loss was known. They've been unsuccessful in fixing this issue of the courts deciding that a loss has happened over 20 years, but at least they thought they could put a line in the sand. Before this time, the loss was unknown. After this time, the loss was known. If the loss is known, we're not paying for it. The wording about when a loss is known is often referred to as Montrose wording. So if you're in the industry and you've heard that term, as I have, this is nominally what it is referring to. I say nominally for two reasons. One, because the word Montrose doesn't actually show up anywhere in the wording that is called Montrose wording. And two, it's not actually wording about pollution, and so it can be confusing to people. There is also a third reason, which is that sometimes people will ask you about Montrose wording that is not even remotely related to this. Go figure. Montrose wording started out as an endorsement or something you attached to an insurance policy, and it eventually became part of the policy itself. And basically, what the wording does is it draws a line between when a loss is known and when it is unknown, based on who knew about it. So if we were going to use Montrose as an example, when someone at the managerial level knew about it, the loss was officially known. And if you think that feels like a dig at the whole EPA potentially responsible party letter being just a letter, I also think that too. CERCLA, Superfund, actions surrounding Montrose continue, though banning DDT use in the U.S., as well as the existing cleanup efforts and the work done by environmentalists, mean that many of the species seriously affected by DDT are showing significant population recovery. That's awesome. The Montrose Superfund site and the JB Stringfellow acid pits, those continue, but it's unclear how changes at the EPA in 2025 will affect this. The cleanup is complicated. by the fact that a deep-sea expedition diver found the location of Montrose's ocean dumping, and the NOAA went down to examine it in 2021. The NOAA counted 27,000 barrels of DDT waste, but paperwork from Montrose and California Salvage suggests there may be as many as 500,000 barrels of DDT waste in the ocean off the coast of California. And some of them are leaking. It's still unsafe to eat certain fish in those areas near the Superfund sites. And at this point, will cleanup even continue? I am not sure. DDT had an unexpected resurgence in the late 1990s and 2000s. It didn't come back in favor in the U.S., though Zika and West Nile outbreaks here certainly resulted in serious discussions about whether or not we should use it again. DDT use continues in Asia and Africa as an attempt to control the cost of fighting malaria. The more expensive pesticides might work better, but DDT is still cheap and a handful of countries still manufacture it. From an insurance versus history standpoint, well, you could argue that the fact this case is still not resolved makes it a win for insurance, but I'm going with history as the winner here, though technically the only ones who really win in a 40-year legal fight are, well, the lawyers. But someone was going to have to pay for cleaning up all the pollution from DDT, and while U.S. taxpayers did end up footing a lot of the bill, the insurance companies paid for a lot of it, and they probably will pay for more of it in the end. If you want to know more about Montrose Chemical, join me over on LinkedIn for more information on this episode, including a lot of the technical and super legal stuff I cut out, and other interesting insurance stories. Show notes, a list of sources, and additional reading suggestions can be found on my website. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe to the show on your preferred platform to be notified of new episodes as soon as they drop. And let other people know about the podcast by spreading the word. And remember, be safe, be smart, and read your policy wording. My pollution has a first name. It's Bayer. Oh, that's not right.